The air in Black Creek tasted different 15 years ago. It didn't taste like ash and engine exhaust. It tasted of pine resin, frozen earth, and the sharp metallic tang of impending snow. At 4 a.m. on that Tuesday in November, Elias Thorne sat on the edge of his bed, the springs of the mattress groaning under his frame. He was 45 then, a man carved out of granite and oak, his joints still fluid, his eyes sharp enough to spot a hair blinking against a snowbank from 300 yards away. He was not yet a ghost. He was the town's anchor. Elias laced his boots, the leather stiff and cold, pulling the laces tight until he felt the reassuring pressure against his ankles. Outside the frosted window of his cabin, the world was a study in indigo and charcoal. The northern ridge loomed above the town, a jagged silhouette cutting into the star-dusted belly of the sky. It was silent, but to Elias the mountain was never truly quiet. It hummed, a low, subsonic vibration of shifting tectonic plates and groaning ice. Today the hum felt different, tenser, like a violin string wound just a fraction too tight. He poured the dregs of the coffee pot into a thermos, the black liquid steaming in the frigid kitchen. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the heavy, authoritative rap of a man who owned the wood the door was made of. Elias opened it to find Mayor Arthur Sterling standing on the porch, his breath pluming in the harsh porch light. Beside him, shivering despite a brand-new, expensive parka that still creaked with stiffness, was Jacob. "Morning, Elias," Arthur said, his voice booming too loud for the hour. He clapped a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder. "Ready to make a man out of him?" Jacob offered a weak, nervous smile. He was 18, soft around the edges, with eyes that hadn't seen enough of the world to know what fear looked like. He held a rifle that cost more than Elias's truck, a custom bolt-action with a walnut stock so polished it looked like liquid amber. He held it awkwardly like a borrowed instrument. "The weather is turning, Arthur," Elias said, leaning against the doorframe, ignoring the mayor's joviality. He looked past them toward the ridge. Barometer dropped 10 points since midnight. The wind is shifting from the east. That means heavy loads on the leeward slopes. Arthur waved a dismissive hand. "The forecast says clear skies until noon. That's all you need. Just get him up to the plateau, bag the elk and get down. He's leaving for college on Monday, Elias. I want him to have this. I want him to have a story to tell." Elias looked at the boy. Jacob wasn't arrogant like his father. He was just eager to please, eager to be the version of himself his father wanted. There was a softness in the boy's gaze that the mountain would not respect. "We stick to the lower tree-line," Elias said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "We don't go past the Devil's Thumb." "Fine, fine," Arthur agreed, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Just get it done. Bring my boy home with a trophy." The drive up the logging road was quiet. The heater in Elias's old Ford rattled, fighting a losing battle against the permeating chill. Jacob fidgeted with the scope of his rifle. "My dad says you're the best," Jacob said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He says you know this mountain better than the surveyors." "The mountain doesn't let you know it, kid," Elias replied, keeping his eyes on the rutted track illuminated by the yellow beams of the headlights. "It just tolerates you, until it doesn't." They parked at the trailhead as the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly gray over the horizon. The ascent began. Elias set a pace that was deceptive, slow, rhythmic, aimed at conserving heat and breath. Jacob struggled to match it, his movements jerky and wasteful. Elias stopped frequently, pretending to check signs, allowing the boy to catch his breath without bruising his ego. By 8 a.m., they were nearing the Devil's Thumb, a massive protrusion of granite that marked the transition from the safety of the dense forest to the exposed, unforgiving alpine zone. The world here was monochrome. The silence was absolute, swallowed by the depth of the snowpack. "Look," Elias whispered, pointing a gloved finger. Across the valley, on a ridge parallel to theirs, a herd of elk moved like smoke through the trees. They were too far for a shot, but the sight was majestic enough to make Jacob gasp. "Can we get closer?" Jacob whispered, his eyes wide. "No," Elias said. He was looking up, not at the elk. The sky had changed. The pale gray had curdled into a thick, opaque white. The wind had died completely. A vacuum of pressure that made Elias's inner ear ache. "We're turning back." "What? Why?" Jacob protested, his voice rising. "They're right there. If we cross the saddle, we can cut them off." "Look at the snow, Jacob." Elias knelt, scooping up a handful. The top layer was powdery, light as dust, but underneath was a hard, slick crust of ice from last week's thaw-freeze cycle. "This is a slab waiting to slide. New snow on old ice. It's unstable. And the wind is picking up top. I can hear it." "Dad will be furious," Jacob muttered, looking at the ridge with longing. "He spent $3,000 on this gear. Your dad isn't here. I am." Elias stood up, slinging his rifle. "We go down. Now." He turned, expecting Jacob to follow. But the boy hesitated. In that split second of hesitation, the mountain made its decision. It didn't start with a roar. It started with a crack. A sharp, sickening sound like a gunshot magnified 1,000 times, echoing from the peaks above them. Elias spun around. High above the Devil's Thumb, the white face of the mountain seemed to shatter. A fracture line raced across the slope, hundreds of yards wide. For a heartbeat, the slab of snow hung suspended, defying gravity. "Run!" Elias screamed, the word tearing at his throat. He lunged for Jacob, grabbing the strap of the boy's expensive parka. But the mountain was faster. The slab broke free, and the world dissolved into violence. It wasn't just snow. It was a tidal wave of ice, rock, and uprooted trees moving at 80 miles an hour. The roar was physical, a sonic boom that vibrated in the marrow of Elias's bones. He saw the terror in Jacob's eyes, a moment of pure, crystallized realization of mortality. "Cover your head," Elias roared, throwing his weight against the boy, trying to shove him behind the limited shelter of a pine tree. Then the white darkness hit them. It was like being hit by a freight train made of concrete. Elias was lifted off his feet, tumbled, and thrashed. There was no up, no down. His mouth filled with snow. His rifle was ripped from his back. He felt his ribs crack, a sharp fire in his side, but adrenaline numbed the pain. He flailed his arms, swimming through the churning debris, fighting the instinct to gasp for air. "Swim," his mind commanded. "Stay on top." The tumbling slowed. The roar faded to a hiss, then to a silence so profound it felt heavy. The snow set like concrete around him. Elias opened his eyes. Darkness. He was buried. Panic, cold and reptilian, coiled in his gut. He forced himself not to hyperventilate. He wiggled his fingers. His right hand was free, protruding into the open air. He clawed frantically, dragging himself upward. He broke the surface, gasping, the cold air burning his lungs like acid. He was alive. He was waist-deep in the debris field, surrounded by snapped tree trunks that looked like broken matchsticks. "Jacob!" His voice was small in the vast, indifferent white amphitheater. "Jacob!" Nothing. No movement. No color. Just the endless, blinding white. Elias scrambled out of the hole, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs. He scanned the avalanche path. He saw a boot. Just a boot. He threw himself at the snow, digging with his bare hands until his fingernails tore and bled. He dug like a madman, sobbing, cursing, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. He found the rifle first. The walnut stock was snapped clean in two. He kept digging. 10 minutes. 20. An hour. He found the parka. Then the boy. Jacob was blue. His neck was at an angle that sickened Elias to his core. The life had been crushed out of him instantly, likely by the impact against the tree Elias had tried to push him behind. Elias collapsed. He sat in the snow, cradling the boy's body, rocking back and forth. The storm that Elias had predicted finally arrived, snow beginning to fall gently, indifferent to the tragedy it was covering. The descent was a blur of agony. Elias couldn't leave him. He wouldn't. He fashioned a travois out of branches and his own coat, strapping Jacob's body to it. He dragged the burden down the mountain. Every step was a penance. The trip that had taken 4 hours to climb took 10 hours to descend. He reached the trailhead well after dark. The searchlights were already sweeping the treeline. Sheriff Miller was there. Arthur Sterling was there. When Elias emerged from the shadows of the forest, dragging the sled, the commotion stopped. The silence of the mountain seemed to follow him down, infecting the townspeople. Arthur Sterling ran forward, his face a mask of frantic hope that shattered the moment he saw the angle of the boy's head. He collapsed into the snow, a wail of animal grief tearing from his throat. Elias stood there, shivering, his hands raw meat, his face caked with dried blood and ice. He waited for someone to ask if he was okay. He waited for a blanket. Instead, Sheriff Miller approached, his face hard. "What happened, Elias?" The slope gave way. Elias whispered, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "I told him. I tried." Arthur looked up from his dead son. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a venomous, misplaced hatred. He needed someone to blame. The mountain was too big, too abstract. Elias was right there. "You were supposed to keep him safe," Arthur hissed. He stood up, trembling with rage. "You're the expert. You're the tracker. How come you're walking and my boy is dead?" "Arthur! The snow! You let him die!" Arthur screamed, lunging at Elias, only held back by the sheriff. "You coward! You saved yourself and you let my boy die." The word hung in the air. Coward. Elias looked around the circle of faces. People he had known all his life. Friends. Neighbors. He saw the doubt creeping into their eyes. He saw them looking at his living, breathing body, and then at the broken boy on the sled. The narrative was already writing itself in their minds. The expert who abandoned the novice to save his own skin. Elias didn't fight back. He didn't explain the physics of the slab, or the warning he gave, or the way he had dug until his hands were ruined. The guilt was already a heavy stone in his gut. Arthur just gave it a name. He turned away from the lights, from the warmth of the running engines, from the life he had known. "Go home, Elias," Sheriff Miller said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Just go." Elias walked past his truck. He kept walking. He walked through the main street of Black Creek, feeling the eyes of the town behind the windows. He walked until the pavement turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to a narrow trail leading to the old trapper's shack at the edge of the wilderness. He opened the door to the cold, empty shack. He didn't light a fire. He sat in the dark, the smell of pine and blood still filling his nose, and listened to the wind howl. That night, Elias Thorne died, and the ghost of Black Creek was born. 15 years is a long time for a town to curdle, but for the mountain, it is less than a blink. For Elias Thorne, however, 15 years was an epoch of geological pressure, compressing a man into a diamond of hard, sharp silence. The cabin had changed, much like its occupant. The roof sagged in the middle, mimicking the swayback of an old mule, and the siding had turned the silver gray of driftwood. Inside, the space was Spartan, stripped of the domestic softness that had existed before the avalanche. There were no photographs, no rugs, just the essentials of survival. A wood stove that ticked and popped as it cooled, a cot tight against the drafty wall, and racks of drying furs that filled the air with the musk of pine, marten, and beaver. Elias sat at the rough-hewn table, the morning light filtering through dirt-streaked glass to illuminate his hands. They were different hands now. The knuckles were swollen with arthritis that flared when the pressure dropped, and the skin was a map of scars, nicks from skinning knives, burns from the stove, and the deep, jagged white line on his forearm where he had slipped on the scree 3 winters back. He was sharpening a blade, the rhythmic shh of steel on whetstone the only sound in the room. He stopped. The rhythm broke. Elias didn't look up, but his head tilted slightly to the left. He wasn't listening to the room. He was listening to the world outside. The squirrels in the attic, usually a chaotic chorus of scratching at this hour, were silent. The wind, which usually whistled through the gap in the window frame, had ceased entirely. The silence was heavy, physical, pressed against his eardrums. He stood up, his knees popping, and walked to the door. When he opened it, the air that greeted him wasn't just cold. It was dead. The sky was a bruised purple, hanging so low it felt like he could reach up and scrape his fingernails against the clouds. The birds were gone. Not just quiet, gone. The valley below, usually teeming with the morning activity of jays and crows, was a vacuum. "It's coming," Elias murmured. His voice was rusty, a mechanism used so rarely it had begun to seize. He stepped back inside and turned on the small, battery-operated radio he kept for emergencies. The cheerful voice of the weatherman from Denver crackled through the static. "Looking at a front moving in from the northwest, bringing light snow by evening. Expect 3 to 5 inches in the high country, tapering off by morning. Good news for the ski resorts." Elias clicked the radio off. "Fools," he whispered. The barometer on his wall, an old brass instrument that had belonged to his grandfather, told a different truth. The needle had plummeted so far left it was nearly touching the peg. This wasn't 3 to 5 inches. This was a white burial. He needed kerosene. He needed matches. And he needed them now. The walk into town was a 3-mile descent through the purgatory of the foothills. Elias moved with a gait that had become famous in local whispers. A rolling, uneven lurch caused by a hip that never healed right after the avalanche, combined with the effortless silence of a predator. He wore the furs he trapped himself, a patchwork coat of coyote and deer hide that smelled of blood and smoke, making him look like a creature from a forgotten folklore. As he reached the paved road that marked the boundary of Black Creek proper, the atmosphere shifted. It was Christmas Eve. The town was dressed in its holiday best, oblivious to the monster cresting the ridge behind it. Strings of colored bulbs were draped across Main Street, blinking in disjointed rhythms. A giant inflatable Santa Claus waved maniacally from the lawn of the hardware store, tethered by ropes that strained against the stillness. A passing pickup truck slowed down as it approached him. Elias kept his head down, eyes fixed on the gray slush of the gutter. He felt the driver's gaze, a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. The truck sped up, coating his boots in a spray of dirty ice water. He was the boogeyman, the cautionary tale, the man who let the boy die. He pushed open the door to Joe's General Store and Diner. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, welcoming sound that seemed to strangle itself the moment he stepped across the threshold. The diner was warm, smelling of bacon grease, stale coffee, and pine sol. It was crowded. A group of loggers occupied the corner booth, laughing over plates of eggs. 2 young mothers sat at the counter, their children spinning on the vinyl stools. Behind the register stood Joe, balder and fatter than he had been 15 years ago, but possessing the same nervous eyes. The silence spread like an infection. It started at the counter and rippled outward. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks lowered to plates with quiet clinks. Every pair of eyes in the room fixed on Elias. He was a stain on their festive canvas, a reminder of the darkness they tried to keep at bay with electric lights and tinsel. Elias walked to the back aisle, his boots leaving muddy prints on the checkerboard floor. He felt the eyes on his back, heavy and hot. He grabbed 3 boxes of heavy-duty matches, 2 jugs of kerosene, and a pack of beef jerky. When he reached the counter, Joe didn't look him in the eye. He stared pointedly at the register screen. $32.50, Joe muttered. Elias reached into his coat, pulling out a crumpled wad of cash. His fingers, blackened with soot and cold, placed the bills on the counter. He was careful not to touch Joe's hand. He knew the rules. "Mommy, is that the monster?" The voice was high, clear, and innocent, cut through the tension like a razor. Elias froze. He turned his head slowly. Sitting 3 stools down was a little girl, maybe 7 years old. She had hair the color of spun gold and eyes that were too big for her face. She was pointing a small finger at him, her other hand clutching a half-eaten pancake. "Lily," the woman beside her hissed. It was Sarah, the baker's wife. She looked at Elias with a terror that made his stomach turn. She grabbed the girl's arm. pulling her close, shielding her body as if Elias were radioactive. "Don't look at him. Eat your food." "But he looks like a bear," Lily whispered, her curiosity unquenched. She smiled at him, a genuine, gap-toothed smile. Elias felt a crack in the armor he had spent 15 years welding shut. He tried to remember how to smile back, but the muscles in his face wouldn't cooperate. He just nodded, a small, jerky motion. "Leave the girl alone, Elias." A voice boomed from the doorway. Sheriff Miller stood there. He had aged too. His hair was iron gray, and his waistline hung over his belt, but the badge on his chest still gleamed. He looked at Elias with the same disdain he had worn that night at the trailhead. "Just buying supplies, Miller?" Elias rasped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer. It was the first time he had spoken to another human being in 6 months. "Buy them and get out," Miller said, stepping aside to hold the door open, not as a courtesy, but as an eviction notice. "People are trying to enjoy their holiday." Elias picked up his bags. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at Sarah. But as he passed the girl, he saw her wave. A tiny, fluttery wave of pink fingers. He stepped out into the cold, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt like a sentence. The sky had changed in the 20 minutes he had been inside. The purple was gone, replaced by a wall of white that erased the peaks of the mountains. The wind was back, but now it was screaming. The inflatable Santa was flat against the ground, thrashing. Elias stopped on the sidewalk. He looked up. The first snowflake landed on his cheek. It wasn't a soft Christmas card flake. It was hard, icy, and sharp. It stung. "Go home," he whispered to the town that hated him. "Get inside and lock your doors." But no one could hear him over the rising wind. He began the trudge back toward the trail, but something made him pause. A bark, high-pitched and frantic. He looked toward the edge of the woods, near the park where the town held its summer picnics. A golden retriever was bounding through the snow, chasing something. A rabbit, perhaps, or just a shadow. And running after it, a splash of bright red against the gray world, was a small figure. Lily. She was laughing, her voice carried away by the gale. She was chasing the dog toward the treeline. Elias took a step forward, his mouth opening to shout a warning. But then he saw Sarah running from the diner, shouting, "Buster! Lily, get back here." The mother had seen her. She was handling it. It wasn't his business. Nothing in this town was his business anymore. Elias turned his collar up and walked away. He had made it half a mile up the logging road when the world ended. It didn't happen gradually. The storm didn't build. It collapsed. One moment there was visibility for 50 yards. The next, he couldn't see his own hand at the end of his arm. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind roared like a jet engine, tearing branches from the pines and hurling them like javelins. Elias was knocked to his knees. He dropped the kerosene. He had to crawl to the nearest tree, wrapping his arms around the rough bark to anchor himself. This is it, he thought. The big one. He waited out the initial fury, his face pressed into the fur of his coat. 10 minutes passed. When the wind lulled slightly, shifting from a hurricane force to a steady, blinding gale, he stood up. He had to get to his cabin. If he stayed out here, even he would die. But then, the sound reached him. It was faint, carried on a whimsical eddy of the wind. But to a man who had spent 15 years listening to the silence of snow, it was as loud as a gunshot. A siren. The air raid siren atop the fire station, used only for catastrophes. Elias stood still, the snow plastering his beard, turning him into a statue of ice. He looked up the mountain toward his warm stove and his solitude. Then he looked back toward the town. "Don't do it," the voice in his head hissed. "They hate you. Let them save themselves." He took a step toward the cabin. Then he remembered the gap-toothed smile. He remembered the little red mitten waving at him. "Damn it!" Elias growled. He turned around and walked back into hell. By the time he reached the diner, the scene was chaos. Several cars had slid off the road, their headlights cutting uselessly into the swirling white soup. People were shouting, their voices thin and panicked. Inside the diner, the warmth was gone. The door was propped open, snow drifting onto the checkerboard floor. Sarah was on the ground, held up by Joe and another woman. She was screaming, a sound that tore through the storm's roar. She went in. She went into the trees. I couldn't catch her. Sheriff Miller was shouting orders, trying to be the anchor. Get the snowmobiles. Johnson, get the thermal scopes. We need a line search, 10-yard intervals. The men were scrambling, zipping up jackets, grabbing flashlights. They were moving with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of terrified amateurs. Elias stepped into the light of the doorway. He was covered in snow, a white specter looming out of the night. Miller! Elias shouted over the wind. The room quieted. Miller turned, his face red with stress and cold. When he saw Elias, his expression hardened into granite. I told you to go home, Elias. We have a situation. I know you have a situation, Elias said, stepping closer. And I know you're about to kill those men and that girl if you go out there with sleds. Excuse me? Miller stepped forward, chest puffed out. The wind is out of the north-northwest, Elias said, speaking fast, his eyes darting to the map on the wall. It's pushing the drift into the Devil's Gulch. If the girl followed the dog, she didn't go up the trail. The dog would seek shelter from the wind. It would go into the hollows down into the drainage. We know how to search a grid, Elias. Miller spat. You can't take snowmobiles into the drainage, Elias pressed, his voice rising. The snow is too soft. There's powder on top of slick ice. The vibration of the engines will trigger slides on the banks. You'll bury her before you find her. And what do you suggest? Miller sneered. We walk. In this? Yes, you walk. Or you snowshoe. And you don't use the main lights. You use infrared if you have it, or you track. You look for the breakage in the brush. She's small. She'll crawl under the deadfall. We don't have time for your primitive nonsense. Miller roared, losing his composure. That is a 7-year-old girl out there. We are taking the fastest machines we have. Fast machines make noise, Elias shouted back. The wolves are moving tonight, Miller. I heard them 3 nights ago. They're hungry. The noise will scatter the deer, but it will draw the pack. If she's injured, if she's bleeding. Enough. Miller shoved Elias. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough to make the older man stumble on his bad leg. You want to help? Get out of the way. You had your chance to save a kid on this mountain, and we all know how that ended. I'm not letting you near this one. The diner went deadly silent. The insult hung in the air, heavier than the storm. Elias looked at Miller. He looked at the men adjusting their helmets, avoiding his gaze. He looked at Sarah, who was sobbing too hard to hear the conversation. He realized then that it didn't matter what he knew. It didn't matter that he could tell the difference between a fox track and a coyote track by the depth of the claw marks. It didn't matter that he knew the mountain's heartbeat. To them, he was just a failure. Slowly, Elias straightened his coat. He brushed the snow from his shoulder where Miller had touched him. You're going to the ridge, Elias said quietly. She isn't there. Get out, Miller said, turning his back. Move out, men. We launch in 5. Elias backed out of the doorway. The wind caught the door and slammed it shut in his face, sealing the warmth and the light away from him. He stood alone in the parking lot. The snowmobiles roared to life, their engines screaming like angry hornets. He watched them peel out, heading toward the main trailhead, heading toward the high ground, just as he knew they would. Heading exactly where Lily wasn't. Elias looked down at his own hands. They were trembling, not from cold, but from rage. He could go home. He could walk back to his cabin, lock the door, and drink himself into a stupor until the storm passed. When they found the frozen body in the spring, he could say, I told you so. He looked toward the dark, gaping maw of the forest to the east. The drainage, the hollows, the place where the wind couldn't reach, but where the shadows were deep and the teeth were sharp. Damn you all, he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the box of matches he had bought. He checked his knife. He tightened the laces on his boots. He didn't have a flashlight. He didn't have a radio. He didn't have a team. He turned his back on the town, on the lights, on the roaring snowmobiles. He walked toward the drainage, disappearing into the whiteout like a ghost returning to its haunt. If they wouldn't listen, he would have to do it the only way he knew how. Alone. The transition from the artificial glow of Black Creek to the absolute void of the wilderness was instantaneous and violent, like stepping off the edge of the world. One moment, the amber halo of the streetlights offered a deceptive promise of direction. The next, the darkness swallowed Elias whole. The wind here was not merely moving air. It was a physical weight, a crushing, turbulent ocean of ice that slammed against his chest, forcing the air back down his throat before he could inhale. He didn't walk into the forest so much as he leaned into the gale and let it catch him, fighting for every inch of purchase on the frozen earth. Elias knew this drainage. In the summers, the Devil's Gulch was a jagged scar in the landscape, a dry creek bed choked with brambles and loose shale that tourists avoided because of the rattlesnakes. Now, buried under 3 feet of fresh powder and scoured by 60-mile-per-hour gusts, it was a tomb in the making. The topography funneled the wind, turning the ravine into a wind tunnel that amplified the chill factor to something lethal. He pulled his scarf tighter, the wool scratching raw skin, covering everything but a narrow slit for his eyes. Even then, his eyelashes were already heavy with ice, freezing shut every time he blinked. He moved by memory and by touch. Sight was useless. The beam of his small headlamp, a cheap thing he'd had in his pocket, reflected off the driving snow, creating a wall of blinding white static that was more disorienting than the dark. He clicked it off. Better to embrace the darkness and let his other senses take over. He felt the terrain through the soles of his boots. He knew the sudden drop of the terrain by the shift in the wind's pitch, a low moan that signaled the deep hollows where the snow would be soft and treacherous. Go back, the logical part of his brain screamed. It was the voice of the survivor, the part of him that had kept him alive in that cabin for 15 years. You have no gear. You have no rope. You are walking into a meat grinder. But then another voice answered. It wasn't a thought, but a feeling. A phantom sensation of a small, warm hand in his, and the memory of a boy's face looking at him with trust before the mountain fell. Not again. Elias grit his teeth, the sound grinding in his skull. Not another ghost. He reached the edge of the descent. The ground fell away sharply into the gulch. He didn't climb down. He slid, digging his heels into the snow to act as brakes, his gloved hands grasping at passing roots and exposed rocks. The shale beneath the snow was slick with ice. Halfway down, his bad leg, the one crushed in the avalanche years ago, caught on a submerged root. A bolt of agony, white-hot and nauseating, shot up his hip to the base of his neck. He gasped, his mouth filling with freezing powder, and tumbled the last 20 feet, landing hard in a drift at the bottom. For a long moment Elias lay there. The pain in his hip was a pulsing siren, drowning out the wind. The cold rushed in to fill the gaps in his armor, seeping through the layers of deer hide and wool. It would be so easy to stay here. The snow was surprisingly warm once you stopped fighting it. Cradled you. It whispered that sleep was safe. He forced himself to move. He rolled onto his stomach, screaming internally as his hip protested, and pushed himself up to his knees. "Get up, old man," he growled aloud, his voice lost instantly in the roar. "She's smaller than you. She's colder than you." He stood, swaying. He was in the belly of the gulch now. Here, the wind was less direct, broken by the high walls of the ravine, but the snow was deeper. It was waist-high in places, a shifting quicksand of powder. He began to hunt. Tracking in a blizzard is impossible, the books say. The snow fills tracks within minutes. But Elias wasn't looking for footprints. He was looking for disturbance. He was looking for the story the landscape told. He moved slowly, sweeping his arm in front of him like a blind man's cane. He felt the brush. There. A branch of a scrub oak, snapped at hip height. Fresh. The wood was still green and moist at the break, not dry and brittle. Something heavy had crashed through here recently. A deer? No, a deer would leap over or weave through. This was something that panicked, something that ran blindly. He followed the trajectory of the broken branch. 10 yards further, he found a depression in the snow, barely visible. A spot where someone had fallen and scrambled back up. He knelt, pulling off his glove to touch the impression with his bare hand. The snow was packed down hard at the bottom. He felt the texture. Not a hoof print. A boot. A small, flat-soled boot. "I've got you," he whispered. The adrenaline surged, dulling the pain in his leg. He pushed forward, moving faster now. The tracks were faint, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, but the line was consistent. She was heading deeper into the gulch, moving downwind, instinctively turning her back to the gale. It was the natural reaction, but it was leading her into a trap. The gulch ended in a box canyon, a cul-de-sac of vertical rock walls. If she reached the end, there was no way out, and the snow drifted 10 feet deep against those walls. Elias checked his watch. He had been out for an hour. Hypothermia would be setting in for her. The confusion first, then the lethargy. She would stop feeling cold. She would feel hot. She would take off her coat. That was the end. He trudged on, his breath coming in ragged rasps. The solitude was oppressive. In the town, even with the hatred directed at him, there was the presence of life. Here, he was the only living thing in a dead world. Or so he thought. The wind shifted, swirling down from the ridge above, and it brought a scent that stopped Elias in his tracks. It was faint, musky, and primal. Wet fur. He froze, becoming a statue in the storm. He slowly reached over his shoulder and unslung the old double-barreled shotgun he had strapped to his pack, a weapon he hadn't fired in years. He broke the breech, checking the shells by feel. 2 shots. That was all he had. He scanned the darkness. The white curtain of snow limited his vision to maybe 10 feet. Beyond that, the shadows moved and shifted, playing tricks on his mind. Was that a tree stump, or a crouched figure? Was that the wind whistling through the rocks, or a low growl? He wasn't alone. The wolves in the Rockies had been making a comeback, and usually Elias respected them. They were honest hunters. But a winter like this changed the rules. Starvation made them bold. Desperation made them monsters. And tonight they weren't hunting elk. They were hunting the same easy prey he was tracking. Elias realized with a jolt of horror that the tracks he was following had changed. The small boot prints were still there, intermittent and dragging, but now, crossing them, weaving around them, were other tracks. Massive paw prints that hadn't been fully filled by the snow yet. They were hurting her. "No!" Elias shouted, the sound raw and guttural. He abandoned caution. He stopped checking for treacherous footing. He charged through the snow, using his shotgun as a balance pole, plowing through drifts that reached his chest. The pain in his leg became a blinding agony, but he fed on it. He let the pain be the fuel. "Run, coward," he told himself. "Run like you didn't run for Jacob." He visualized the map of the gulch in his mind. Ahead, the ravine narrowed at a place called the Narrows, where 2 granite boulders squeezed the path. It was a perfect ambush point. He scrambled over a fallen pine tree, the rough bark tearing his trousers. He fell face first into the snow, tasting copper and ice. As he pushed himself up, his hand brushed against something that wasn't snow and wasn't wood. He grabbed it. He brought it close to his face, shielding it from the wind with his body. It was the red mitten. He stared at it, a tiny, woolen artifact of a life that was currently fading. It was wet, frozen stiff, but it wasn't torn. There was no blood on it. She had dropped it or taken it off. The paradoxical undressing. The final stage of hypothermia. The brain, starving for oxygen and warmth, misfires and tells the body it is burning up. Victims strip off their clothes just before they die. "Lily!" Elias screamed. He didn't care about the wind anymore. He didn't care if the wolves knew exactly where he was. "Lily! Answer me!" The only answer was the wind, shrieking like a banshee. And then, a sound that cut through the wind. A yelp. Not human. A dog. It came from the left, up a slight incline toward a cluster of boulders. Elias shoved the mitten into his pocket and scrambled up the slope. His lungs were burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He crested the rise and saw them. The scene was illuminated by a break in the storm, a momentary thinning of the clouds that let the faint, ambient light of the moon filter through. The golden retriever, Buster, was backed against a rock face. The dog was valiant, barking and snapping, but he was limping, blood staining his golden flank. And behind the dog, curled into a small ball in the crevice of the rock, was a patch of pink. Facing them were three shadows. They were gaunt, rib cages showing through their winter coats, their eyes reflecting the minuscule light with a green, predatory luminescence. They were silent. Wolves don't bark when they attack. They coordinate. The alpha, a massive male with a scarred ear, was lowering his head, preparing to lunge at the dog. Once the dog was gone, the child was theirs. Elias was 40 yards away, too far for a shotgun with birdshot, which was likely what was loaded. He needed to be closer. But if he moved, he would startle them, and they might attack before he could get there. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He acted on the ancient instinct that had been dormant for 15 years. He racked the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack distinct and loud. The wolves spun around. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Elias stood tall on the ridge, the wind whipping his coat around him, making him look twice his size. He raised the gun not at the wolves, but at the sky. "Get away from her," he roared. It wasn't the voice of a broken old man. It was the voice of the apex predator, the one who had claimed this mountain long before the pack arrived. He pulled the trigger. Boom! The muzzle flash was a blinding explosion of orange in the monochrome world. The sound was deafening, rolling down the canyon walls like thunder. The wolves flinched. The alpha stepped back, ears flattened. But they didn't run. They were too hungry. They assessed him. One man, old, injured. Elias broke the barrel, ejecting the spent shell, and fumbled in his pocket for a reload with frozen fingers. He had 1 shot left in the gun. If he missed or if they rushed him, it was over. He started walking down the slope toward them. He walked with a heavy, stomping cadence. He didn't limp. He forced his body to obey. "Mine," he snarled, locking eyes with the alpha. "She is mine." He grabbed a flare from his belt, the one piece of emergency gear he always carried. He struck it against the rock. It sputtered and hissed, then erupted into a blinding magnesium red glare. He held the shotgun in one hand and the burning red sun in the other, marching into the circle of death. The combination of the thunderous gunshot, the unnatural red fire, and the sheer aggression of the figure advancing on them broke the pack's nerve. The alpha snarled, snapping his jaws at the air, but as Elias swung the sputtering flare in a wide arc, sending sparks flying, the beast turned. With a low whine of frustration, the alpha bolted into the darkness. The other 2 followed instantly, dissolving into the storm like smoke. Elias didn't stop. He didn't watch them go. He dropped the flare in the snow, where it continued to hiss, casting a blood-red light over the scene. He fell to his knees beside the dog and the girl. The dog licked his face, whimpering, but Elias pushed the animal gently aside. He reached into the crevice. Lily was ice-cold. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was the color of porcelain, translucent and blue-veined. She wasn't shivering anymore. "No, no, no," Elias muttered, his hands trembling as he stripped off his heavy outer coat. The cold hit him instantly, a sledgehammer blow to his chest, but he ignored it. He wrapped the massive, warm fur around her tiny body. He pulled off his gloves and rubbed her cheeks, trying to spark friction, trying to call the blood back to the surface. "Wake up, little bird," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't get to sleep. Not yet." He checked for a pulse. It was there, a faint, fluttery thing, like a moth trapped under glass. It was slowing down. He looked around. The flare was dying. The wolves were gone, but they would be back. They would circle, watch, and wait for the cold to finish the job for them. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't build a fire in this wind. It would never catch. He had to move her. He looked up at the wall of the ravine he had just descended. It was steep, slick, and treacherous. And now he had to climb it carrying 50 pounds of dead weight, with a bad hip in a blizzard with predators stalking his shadow. Elias grabbed the dog by the collar. "You can walk, boy? You gotta walk." The dog whined but stood up on 3 legs. Elias scooped Lily up. She was dangerously limp in his arms. He adjusted her so she was strapped against his chest, inside his inner jacket, skin to skin as much as possible to share his body heat. He tied the sleeves of his outer coat around her to secure her to him. He stood up. The weight settled onto his bad hip, and his vision grayed out for a second from the pain. He grunted, biting his lip until he tasted blood. "One step," he whispered to the darkness. "Just one step." He took a step, then another. He began the climb out of the Devil's Gulch, leaving the red glow of the dying flare behind him, stepping back into the blindness of the storm. He was carrying the town's hope on his back, but the mountain wasn't done with him yet. The climb would be the hardest thing he had ever done, and the alpha wolf was still watching from the ridge. The ascent out of Devil's Gulch was not a climb. It was a war of attrition waged against gravity, physics, and the failing machinery of Elias Thorne's own body. The wind at the bottom of the ravine had been a howling tunnel, but as Elias began to claw his way up the 40-degree slope, the gale changed character. It became a chaotic, swirling force that seemed to possess a vindictive intelligence, shoving him downward every time he lifted a boot, packing fresh snow into the crevices he sought for handholds. The world had reduced itself to a claustrophobic sphere of existence. The burning radius of his headlamp's dying batteries, the metronomic thud of his heart against his ribs, and the faint, terrifyingly slow rhythm of the small chest pressed against his own. Lily was a dead weight in the most literal and terrifying sense. Strapped inside his outer coat, bound to him with the sleeves of his flannel shirt and a length of paracord, she was a parasitic burden that was simultaneously sapping his heat and keeping his soul alive. Every inch he gained, the gravity exerted a leverage on his bad hip that felt less like pain and more like structural failure. A grinding of bone on bone that sent white sparks dancing across his vision, obscuring the snow. He reached up, his gloved hand scraping against the frozen shale. He found a root, slick with ice. He tested it. It held. "Up," he grunted, the word tearing from his throat like a jagged stone. He hauled his weight up. His left leg, the ruined one, dragged uselessly for a second before finding purchase in the deep powder. He gasped, the air entering his lungs like swallowed glass. Behind him, a low whine cut through the wind. Buster, the golden retriever, was struggling. The dog was running on 3 legs, his right hind leg holding a deep gash from the wolf's teeth. He scrabbled at the snow, slipping backward, his claws leaving desperate furrows in the ice. Elias paused, clinging to the side of the ravine like a barnacle. He looked back. The dog's eyes were wide, rimmed with the white of panic, reflecting the faint ambient light. Below them, at the very edge of visibility where the darkness of the ravine floor swallowed the light, 2 green orbs floated. The alpha. It hadn't left. It was pacing the bottom of the slope, a patient, shadowy executioner waiting for the inevitable slip. It knew the man was injured. It knew the dog was bleeding. It knew the cold would do the work of the pack without them having to risk another flare. "Come on, boy," Elias hissed, extending a hand back toward the dog. "Don't look at him. Look at me." Buster lunged, his paws scrambling, and managed to find a shelf of rock. He collapsed there, panting, his breath forming instant clouds of ice crystals. Elias turned back to the wall. He couldn't save the dog if he didn't save himself first. He drove his fist into the snow, punching through the crust to find the earth beneath. His fingers were numb blocks of wood. He couldn't feel the rock anymore. He had to trust the vibration of impact to know he had a hold. "Mommy?" The voice was so faint Elias thought it was the wind playing tricks on his decaying mind. Then he felt the movement against his chest. Lily was stirring. "Stay still," Elias rasped, pulling his chin down to tuck into his collar, trying to direct his voice toward her ear. "We're moving. Just sleep." Hot, she murmured, her voice slurring. So hot. Take the blanket off. Fear, colder than the blizzard, spiked in Elias's gut. The paradox. Her brain was frying, the hypothalamus malfunctioning as it shut down. She was in the final stage before the heart stopped. No, Elias said, his voice harsh. It's not hot. It's cold, Lily. It's the coldest night of the world. You keep that coat closed. You hear me? Burning. She whimpered, and he felt her small hands fumbling weakly inside the coat, trying to push the layers away. Elias stopped climbing. He jammed his knee into a drift to anchor himself and wrapped both arms around the bundle on his chest, squeezing her tight, trapping her arms. Listen to me, he roared over the wind, shaking her slightly. You are not hot. You are freezing. Fight it. You want to see your mother? You want to see Buster? Buster? She drifted, the word hanging. Puppy? Yeah, the puppy is right here. Elias lied, or told a half-truth. The dog was 5 feet below them, shivering. He's climbing. He's waiting for you, but you have to stay cold. You have to shiver, Lily. Shiver for me. She didn't answer. Her head lolled against his sternum. Elias looked up. The rim of the ravine was maybe 30 feet away. It might as well have been the moon. Don't you dare, he growled. I didn't carry you this far to bury you. He began to climb again, but this time with a frantic, reckless energy. He ignored the pain. He ignored the way his hip screamed with every articulation. He drove his body like a stolen car, redlining the engine, not caring if it exploded as long as it crossed the finish line. Right hand, left foot, pull, drag. Right hand, left foot, pull, drag. His mind began to fracture. The snow swirling around him started to take shapes. For a moment, the scrub oak to his left wasn't a tree. It was Arthur Sterling, the mayor, standing in judgment. The howling wind wasn't air. It was the roar of the avalanche from 15 years ago. You let him die, Elias. I tried. Elias muttered to the phantom. I tried to hold the mountain back. Coward. Not tonight. Elias spat. He reached up, grabbing a jagged outcrop of granite. The rock sliced his glove, cutting his palm, but he didn't feel it. Not tonight. He hauled himself up another 5 feet. The gradient was steepening near the lip. This was the crux. The snow here was wind-scoured, leaving patches of slick, black ice. He planted his good foot. It held. He swung his bad leg up, trying to hook it over a root. The ice gave way. There was no time to think. His right foot shot out from under him. Gravity, patient and cruel, snatched him. He slid backward, his fingernails clawing uselessly at the ice. He dropped 5 feet, 10 feet. No! He slammed into the shelf where Buster was huddled. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he felt a rib crack. A sharp, distinct snap. The dog yelped and scrambled to get out of the way. Elias lay on his back, staring up at the swirling vortex of white. He was sliding slowly toward the edge of the shelf. Below him, the darkness waited. The alpha wolf let out a short, sharp bark. A signal. Dinner is served. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. The darkness was tempting. It was peaceful. Just let go. The pain would stop. The guilt would stop. Then, a sensation. A small, cold hand pressed against his neck. Mr. Bear? Lily's voice was tiny, clear, and terrified. Did we fall? Mr. Bear. The name hit him like a defibrillator paddle. She didn't call him the monster. She called him the bear. Elias opened his eyes. He roared. A sound that had no words, just pure, animal defiance. He rolled onto his stomach, driving his elbows into the snow. He dug his boots in, kicking, thrashing, fighting the slide. He stopped his descent inches from the drop-off. Yes, little bird, he gasped, spitting blood and snow. We fell, but bears can climb. He looked at the dog. Buster was shivering violently, pressing against the rock wall. Let's go, Elias commanded. He started again. This time, there was no hesitation, no hallucination. There was only the mechanical necessity of survival. He didn't feel his body anymore. He was a machine made of will and gristle. 10 minutes later, his hand, slapped onto the flat, wind-swept surface of the plateau. He dragged himself over the rim, pulling his lower body up with a groan that sounded like tearing metal. He rolled onto the flat ground, the wind hitting him with renewed fury now that he was exposed. But he didn't care. He was out of the hole. He reached back down, grabbing Buster by the scruff of the neck as the dog scrabbled at the final lip, hauling the animal up beside him. They lay there for a minute, a pile of broken creatures huddled together in the void. Elias forced himself to sit up. He checked Lily. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. Her skin felt like marble. "We're not done," he told her, though she was unconscious again. "We're not done." He stood up. The horizon was invisible. The town was 3 miles away across the Devil's Backbone, a flat, exposed ridge where the wind chill would be 40 below zero. He couldn't carry her in his arms anymore. He needed to move faster, and he needed to keep his balance. He looked at the dog. "Stay close." Elias began to walk. The journey across the plateau was a fugue state. Elias didn't know if he was walking for 10 minutes or 10 hours. He counted his steps. 1 to 100. Then start over. 1 to 100. At step 42 of the 5th count, his leg gave out. Not a slip this time, a collapse. His knee simply ceased to function. He fell hard, face first into the snow. He lay there. The cold was inside him now. It was in his blood, slowing his heart. Felt like syrup in his veins. Just close your eyes for a second. Just a second. The snow began to bury him. It drifted over his legs, over his back. It was a heavy, warm blanket. Elias. The voice wasn't Lily's. It wasn't Arthur's. It was deeper, younger. Jacob. Elias didn't open his eyes. Go away, he thought. I'm tired. Get up, Elias. The boy's voice was urgent. You owe me. You didn't save me. Save her. I can't. Elias whispered into the snow. I'm broken. Then crawl. Elias opened his eyes. The world was spinning. He looked at his hands. They were blue. He pushed. His arms shook, but they held. He dragged his body forward. Then again. He was crawling. He was the animal the town thought he was. A beast on all fours, dragging his wounded hindquarters through the drifts. Buster limped beside him, nudging his face with a cold, wet nose every time he stopped moving. He saw the flash of the red paramedic bag. He saw Buster being lifted into the back of a truck by 2 officers. No one was looking at him. He lay in the snow, the spotlight beaming over his head. He was invisible again, the ghost of Black Creek. He had served his purpose. His eyes began to close. The pain was gone. The cold was gone. There was only a soft, white silence. Elias? A face blocked the light. It was Sheriff Miller. The sheriff looked down. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at the trail of blood and dragged snow that led back into the darkness. A trail that stretched for miles into the hell Elias had just walked out of. Miller knelt down. He didn't have his gloves on. He placed a warm hand on Elias's frozen cheek. Don't you die on me, you stubborn son of a bitch, Miller said, his voice shaking. You don't get to die. Not after this. Elias tried to speak, to tell him about the wolves, about the gulch, but his jaw locked. Stretcher, Miller bellowed, turning his head. I need a stretcher here. Now. The world tilted. Elias felt himself being lifted. He saw the sky one last time, the swirling chaos of the storm above. But for the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel the weight of the mountain crushing him. He felt light. As the darkness finally took him, the last thing he heard wasn't the wind, or the wolves, or the accusations of the past. It was the sound of a mother crying, not in grief, but in relief. And somewhere, deep in the recess of his fading consciousness, he heard the click of a lock opening. The cage he had built for himself had finally sprung open. The transition from the white, howling void of the mountain to the sterile, fluorescent violence of the Black Creek Memorial Hospital was not a relief. It was a sensory assault. Elias didn't feel the transition. He was floating in a dark, warm river, drifting toward a waterfall that promised a final, endless sleep. But hands, too many hands, kept pulling him back to the bank. They were rough, insistent, and they brought with them a returning sensation that was worse than the numbness. Fire. As the blood began to recirculate in his frozen extremities, it didn't feel like life returning. It felt like his veins were being filled with molten glass. BP is dropping. 70/40. We need fluids. Warm them to 39 degrees. Cut the clothes. Don't try to undress him. Just cut them. The sounds were distorted, echoing as if through a long metal pipe. The snip of heavy trauma shears biting through the frozen leather of his coat sounded like gunshots. The heavy scent of pine resin and old wood smoke, the smell of his 15-year exile, was stripped away, replaced by the aggressive sting of rubbing alcohol and the metallic tang of iodine. Dr. Elias Thorne, no relation, just a coincidence of geography, stood over the gurney in Trauma Room 1. He had seen frostbite before. He had seen hypothermia. He had treated skiers who got lost out of bounds and hunters who drank too much in their blinds. But he had never seen a human body that looked like this. As the nurses peeled away the layers of wet wool and flannel, a collective silence descended on the room, piercing through the chaotic din of the monitors. Elias's body was a landscape of ruin. It wasn't just the fresh damage, the purple-black mottling of his fingers and toes, or the massive, ugly bruise blooming across his ribcage where he had fallen. It was the history written on his skin, the jagged, silvery scar running from his hip to his knee from the avalanche. The myriad small, white lines of unchecked infections and jagged tears from living in the wild. His ribs pushed against his skin like the hull of a starving ship. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in years. He looked less like a man and more like a piece of tough, dried leather that had been left out in the rain and sun for a decade. Jesus? A young nurse whispered, clutching a bag of saline. How was he even walking? Adrenaline, Dr. Thorne muttered, working quickly to insert a central line. And sheer, stubborn refusal to die. Let's get the bear hugger on him. Maximum setting. We need to warm the core before the periphery, or the cold blood from his legs will stop his heart. In the bay next door, separated by a thin curtain, the scene was different. It was quieter, more frantic in its delicacy. A team of pediatric specialists hovered over Lily. She was pale, her lips a terrifying shade of blue, but the monitor beeped with a steady, if weak, rhythm. Core temp is 88, a doctor announced. She's coming up. The insulation saved her. Whoever wrapped her in this. The doctor gestured to the massive, stinking pile of wet fur and leather on the floor. Whoever wrapped her in this saved her life. It acted like a kiln. Out in the waiting room, the atmosphere was heavy enough to crush lungs. It was 3 a.m. on Christmas morning. The storm was still raging outside, battering the hospital windows with sheets of ice, but the lobby was full. It seemed half the town had squeezed into the plastic chairs. The loggers from the diner were there, turning their hats in their grease-stained hands. The women who had pulled their children away from Elias at the store were there, hugging their own kids tight, eyes wide and wet. Sheriff Miller stood by the vending machine. He hadn't taken off his coat. He hadn't wiped the snow from his shoulders, so now he stood in a puddle of his own making. He stared at the swinging double doors of the ER, his face a mask of gray stone. He was replaying the last 15 years in a loop. Every time he had looked the other way when kids threw rocks at Elias's shack. Every time he had spit on the ground after Elias walked by. Every time he had reinforced the narrative that Elias was a coward who traded a boy's life for his own. You can't take snowmobiles into the drainage. You'll bury her. The voice echoed in Miller's head. Elias had stood there, humiliated, mocked, and dismissed. And he had been right. If Miller had led the team into the gulch with the sleds, the vibration would have triggered the drifts on the north face. They would be digging bodies out right now. Sheriff? Miller snapped his head up. Sarah, Lily's mother, was standing there. She looked like a wraith, hair matted, eyes swollen, wearing a hospital blanket over her shoulders. Sarah, Miller choked out. Any news? She's going to make it, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. They said her temperature is rising. No permanent damage to the organs. Just some frost nip on her toes. A collective exhale went through the room. Men clapped each other on the shoulder. Someone sobbed openly. But Sarah didn't smile. She looked at the doors. What about him? What about Elias? Miller swallowed. The taste of bile was sharp in his throat. I don't know yet. He was crawling, Sheriff, Sarah said, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. When they brought him in, I saw his hands. They were frozen into claws. He was crawling on his stomach. She looked around the room, her gaze challenging everyone who met it. He crawled 3 miles across the devil's backbone carrying my daughter. The silence in the waiting room shifted. It wasn't just relief anymore. It was shame. Thick, suffocating shame. They had called him a monster. And the monster had walked into hell to save a child while the good people rode snowmobiles in the wrong direction. The double doors swung open. Dr. Thorne stepped out, looking exhausted, pulling a surgical mask down from his face. Miller stepped forward, blocking the doctor's path. Doc! He's stable, Thorne said, rubbing his eyes. But it's going to be a long road. He has 3 broken ribs, severe hypothermia, and frostbite on 3 fingers of his right hand and his left foot. We might lose the toes. But his heart is strong. Unnaturally strong. Can I see him? Miller asked. He's sedated. The rewarming process is incredibly painful. We have him on a morphine drip. He needs to sleep, Sheriff. He's been running on fumes since. Well, probably since 2010. Miller nodded, stepping back. He sank into a chair, putting his head in his hands. He realized he was crying. Silent, shaking sobs that he couldn't stop. He was the law in this town, but tonight the law felt very small. The dream was always the same, but this time the ending was different. Elias was back on the mountain. The roar of the avalanche was deafening. He was digging, the snow biting his fingers. He found the blue parka. He pulled. Usually, in the nightmare that had haunted him for 5,475 nights, he would pull Jacob out, and the boy's eyes would be open, staring at him with accusation. The boy would open his mouth and scream, "Why didn't you save me?" But this time Elias pulled. The body came free. It wasn't Jacob. It was Lily. She sat up in the snow, her red mitten clutching his hand. She didn't scream. She smiled. That gap-toothed, innocent smile. "It's okay, Mr. Bear," she said. "You can rest now." Then the snow turned into light. White, blinding light. Elias gasped, his eyes snapping open. The light was real. It was hurting his retinas. He tried to lift his hand to shield his eyes, but his arm wouldn't move. He panic-stricken, thrashing against the restraint. Easy, Mr. Thorne. You're safe." A soft voice. A hand on his shoulder. Elias blinked, his vision swimming into focus. He wasn't in a snowbank. He was in a bed with crisp white sheets. There were tubes in his arms. A machine next to him was making a rhythmic beep-hiss sound. He looked to his right. Sitting in a chair next to the bed was Sarah. She looked tired, but she was clean. Her hair was brushed. She was holding a paper cup of coffee. Elias stopped thrashing. His throat felt like he had swallowed a handful of gravel. "Water," he croaked. Sarah jumped up instantly. She held a cup with a straw to his lips. He drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing the fire in his throat. "Where?" Elias started, but his voice failed him. "You're in the hospital," Sarah said softly, sitting back down. She looked at him with an intensity that made him want to shrink back under the covers. "It's been 2 days, Elias. You've been asleep for 2 days. 2 days. The storm. The wolves. The climb. The girl," Elias whispered. "Lily." Sarah's face crumbled, then reassembled itself into a smile that was pure radiance. "She's awake. She's eating Jell-O. She's asking for her dog." Elias let his head fall back against the pillow, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. A knot in his chest that had been tight for 15 years, loosened just a fraction. The dog? Elias asked. Buster is at the vet. Sarah laughed, a wet, teary sound. He needed 20 stitches in his leg, but he's eating them out of house and home. He's going to be fine. Elias nodded slowly. He looked at his right hand. It was heavily bandaged, elevated on a pillow. He couldn't feel his pinky or ring finger. They said you might lose a few toes, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. And maybe part of a finger. I'm so sorry, Elias. Elias looked at the ceiling. Fair trade, he rasped. Better toes than a life. Why did you do it? Sarah asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for understanding. After everything, after how we treated you. Why? Elias turned his head to look at her. His eyes, usually hidden beneath the shadow of his hood and his brow, were visible now. They were a piercing, icy blue, filled with a sadness that was older than the woman sitting next to him. The mountain took one, Elias said softly. It doesn't get another. Not while I'm breathing. Sarah reached out. She hesitated, then placed her hand over his uninjured left hand. Her skin was warm. Elias flinched instinctively. He wasn't used to touch, but he didn't pull away. Thank you, she said. Thank you for bringing my baby home. The door opened. Sarah pulled her hand back, wiping her eyes. Sheriff Miller walked in. He was in uniform, freshly pressed, but he looked like he hadn't slept in the 2 days Elias had been out. He held his hat in his hands, crushing the brim. Sarah. Miller nodded. Sheriff, she replied. She stood up. I'll go check on Lily. I'll let you two talk. She squeezed Elias's hand one last time and slipped out of the room. The silence that followed was thick. The air conditioner hummed. Miller stood at the foot of the bed, looking at Elias's bandaged feet. Elias looked out the window. The sun was shining. The sky was a brutal, brilliant blue. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. You look like hell, Elias, Miller said finally. I feel like it, Elias replied, his voice flat. He expected the interrogation. He expected to be told he broke some law by discharging a firearm, or for trespassing. Miller walked around the bed and pulled up the chair Sarah had vacated. He sat down heavily. He stared at the floor for a long time. I found the wolves, Miller said quietly, or what was left of the tracks. I went back out there yesterday with a team, retraced your steps. We found the flare casing. We found the blood where the dog fought. Elias said nothing. We climbed the wall, Miller continued, looking up at Elias. With ropes, with crampons, and ice axes. It took 3 of my best deputies an hour to get up that incline. And we weren't carrying a child. Miller shook his head, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. I don't know how you did it, Elias. I honestly don't. That climb. It's physically impossible for a man your age. With your hip. I didn't have a choice, Elias said. You wouldn't listen. Miller flinched as if he'd been slapped. He took a deep breath. No, I wouldn't listen. Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I've been the sheriff of this town for 20 years. I thought my job was to keep the bad things out, to keep order. He looked Elias dead in the eye. 15 years ago, when you came down that mountain alone, I needed a villain. It's easier to have a villain than to accept that nature is just cruel. It was easier to blame you than to tell Arthur Sterling that his son died because of bad luck. Elias's grip on the bedsheet tightened. He was my responsibility. He was a grown man, Miller interrupted firmly. And you warned him. I saw the report, Elias. I saw the geological survey of the slide path later. You were right about the snowpack. You were right about everything. But I buried that, because I was angry, and because Arthur was my friend. Miller stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered town. I poisoned this town against you, Elias. I let them call you a coward because it made us feel better about ourselves. And then, when the time came, when it really mattered, I was the one who was going to get that little girl killed. Not you. Miller turned back. His eyes were wet. I can't give you the last 15 years back. I can't fix the hip. I can't undo the loneliness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something. It was a small, folded piece of paper. He placed it on the bedside table. That's the deed to the old trapper cabin, Miller said, and the 10 acres surrounding it. The council seized it 5 years ago for back taxes. We never evicted you because, well, maybe guilt, but it's yours now, paid in full. The town council voted this morning. Unanimous. Elias looked at the paper, then at Miller. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Miller said sharply. It's a debt. A down payment on a very large debt. Miller put his hat on. He looked at Elias with a new expression. It wasn't friendship, that would take time, maybe years. But it was respect. Deep, terrified respect. When you're ready to leave, Miller said. There's a ride waiting. You don't walk home, Elias. Not anymore. Miller turned to leave. His hand hovered over the doorknob. Elias? Yeah. Arthur Sterling died last year, Miller said softly. Cancer. Before he went. He told me something. He said he forgave you. He just never had the guts to say it to your face. Thought you should know. The door clicked shut. Elias was alone again. But the room didn't feel empty. He looked at the deed on the table. He looked at his bandaged hand. He thought about Arthur. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't see the white wave coming to crush him. He saw the red flare burning in the darkness, pushing the wolves back. He saw the way the dog had looked at him with absolute trust. He wasn't the hunter who let the boy die anymore. He was the hunter who brought the girl home. Elias breathed in. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, but underneath that, he could smell something else. He smelled the future. It was cold, and hard, and uncertain, but it was there. The discharge from Black Creek Memorial came 6 days later, on a Tuesday that felt strangely similar to the one 15 years prior, gray, still, and pregnant with the promise of snow. But the man walking out of the automatic glass doors was not the same man who had walked into the wilderness to die. Elias Thorne moved slower now. The limp in his hip was pronounced, a hitch in his gait that required the support of a sturdy cane. A gift from the nursing staff, polished hickory with a rubber tip. His right foot was bandaged inside a specialized orthopedic boot. The frostbite had taken 2 toes, a permanent tithe paid to the mountain. His right hand, wrapped in gauze, throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, missing the tip of the pinky finger. Sheriff Miller was waiting at the curb, leaning against his patrol SUV. The engine was running, puffing white clouds of exhaust into the frigid air. There were no sirens today, no flashing lights, just the quiet, sturdy presence of a man who had made a promise. Miller didn't say a word as Elias approached. He simply opened the passenger door and held it, a gesture of deference that felt louder than a shout in the quiet morning. Elias climbed in, the warmth of the heater hitting his face like a physical caress. He placed his cane between his knees and stared straight ahead. The ride through town was a surreal montage of the familiar and the alien. They passed the diner. The closed sign was flipped, but Elias could see movement inside. The morning rush. They passed the hardware store, where the inflatable Santa had been deflated and packed away, leaving only a patch of dead, yellow grass on the lawn. People were walking on the sidewalks. A woman in a red coat stopped and watched the police car pass. She didn't glare. She didn't shield her eyes. She just watched, a somber, respectful nod tracking their movement. Elias looked away, his throat tightening. He wasn't ready for their gratitude. He had spent so long building a fortress against their hatred that he had no blueprints for how to handle their kindness. The council cleared the road up to your place, Miller said, breaking the silence as they turned off the main highway onto the logging track. Ran the plow up there twice. Should be able to get a truck in and out now. Waste of gas, Elias grunted, though his hand tightened on the cane. Not a waste, Miller replied softly. You're going to have visitors, Elias, whether you want them or not. They drove up the winding ascent, the tires crunching over the packed snow. The forest closed in around them, the towering pines standing as silent sentinels. This was Elias's world. The deeper they went, the more the tension in his shoulders unspooled. The air smelled right here, clean, sharp, and indifferent to human sorrows. When the cabin came into view, Elias felt a jolt in his chest. It looked different. The roof was still sagging, the siding still gray, but someone had stacked firewood on the porch, neat, symmetrical cords of seasoned oak and pine. Smoke was curling lazily from the chimney. Miller put the car in park. Sarah asked if she could send her husband up to get the stove going this morning. Didn't want you walking into a cold house. Elias nodded, unable to speak. He opened the door and stepped out. The cold bit at his cheeks, but it didn't have the teeth it used to. Or perhaps his skin had just become impervious. "Do you need help getting in?" Miller asked, hand hovering near the door handle. "I can walk," Elias said. He turned to the sheriff. The two men looked at each other, the history of 15 years hanging between them. No longer a wall, but a bridge built over a chasm of regret. "Thanks for the ride, Miller." "Just doing my job, Elias," Miller said. He tipped his hat. "I'll check in on Thursday. Don't lock the door." Elias watched the SUV back down the drive and disappear around the bend. He stood alone in the clearing. The silence of the woods washed over him, but for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. Felt peaceful. He listened. A chickadee was singing somewhere in the canopy. The wind rustled the pine needles. It was the music of the earth, and he was finally tuning back into it not as a victim, but as a participant. He walked up the steps, his cane thumping on the wood. He opened the door. The cabin was warm. The smell of wood smoke and old coffee greeted him. The scent of home. On the rough-hewn table, where he had sharpened his knife on that fateful morning, sat a covered dish. Casserole. Next to it was a thermos and a note. Elias picked up the note. It was written in a child's blocky crayon scrawl. "For Mr. Bear. Thank you for carrying me." Elias stared at the paper. A drop of water hit the page, blurring the blue wax of the letter B. He touched his face. He was crying. He hadn't cried when he lost his toes. He hadn't cried when they reset his ribs. But here, in the sanctuary of his exile, the dam finally broke. He sank into his chair, still wearing his coat, and wept, deep, racking sobs that shook the dust from the rafters. He cried for Jacob. He cried for the 15 years he had stolen from himself. He cried for the little girl who had called him a bear instead of a monster. And as the fire crackled in the stove, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Elias Thorne began the long, slow work of thawing out. Weeks bled into a month. January gave way to February. The harsh grip of winter began to loosen, not in a surrender, but in a gradual retreat. The days grew longer, the sun hanging in the sky with a little more conviction each afternoon. Elias's recovery was a slow, grinding process. He learned to walk with the missing toes, adjusting his balance, finding a new center of gravity. The cane became an extension of his arm, less a crutch and more a tool. He spent his days tending to the small tasks of living. He fixed the hinge on the door. He sorted through his furs. He read the books he had ignored for years, finding comfort in words again. The town kept its distance, but in a respectful way. Every few days he would find something on his porch. A bag of groceries, a box of shotgun shells, a new pair of thick wool socks. They didn't knock. They knew he wasn't ready for conversation. They simply left their offerings and retreated, a silent penance from a community trying to forgive itself. But Elias knew the confrontation was coming. He could feel it. The unfinished business wasn't with the town. It was with the past. It happened on a Tuesday in late February. The weather had turned surprisingly mild, a false spring that made the snow heavy and wet. Elias was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar, when he heard the engine. It wasn't the sheriff's SUV. It was a sedan, struggling slightly on the muddy track. It pulled into the clearing and parked next to his woodpile. Elias stopped whittling. He didn't stand up. He waited. The driver's door opened, and Sarah stepped out. She looked healthier than she had in the hospital, her cheeks flushed with color. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. A golden retriever burst out, bounding toward the porch with a slight limp, his tail waging a furious rhythm. Buster. He ran up the steps and shoved his head into Elias's lap, whining with recognition. Elias couldn't help it. His hand dropped to the dog's head, burying his fingers in the soft fur. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "You healed up good." Then the girl emerged. Lily was wearing a bright pink coat and boots that looked brand new. She walked carefully, holding her mother's hand. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. Her face was grave, her big eyes taking in the old man, the cane, the bandages. "Hello, Elias," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady. "Sarah." Elias nodded. He looked at the girl. "Lily, can we come up?" Sarah asked. Elias moved his knife and the wood shaving aside. "It's a free country." They walked up the steps. Sarah sat on the bench opposite him, but Lily didn't sit. She stood right in front of him, staring at his bandaged foot. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Lily," Sarah admonished gently. "It's okay," Elias said. He looked at the girl. "It hurts when it rains, but mostly it just feels like." Lily nodded, accepting this logic. She reached into her pocket. "I brought you something. Mom said I couldn't bring it to the hospital because it was dirty, but I washed it." She held out her hand. In her small palm sat the red mitten. Elias stared at it. The wool was fuzzy, slightly shrunken from the wash, but the color was still that defiant, vibrant crimson. It was the beacon that had saved her life. It was the breadcrumb in the snow. "I have the other one," Lily said, "but I think you should keep this one, so you don't forget." "Forget what?" Elias asked, his voice rough. "That you're a good finder," Lily said simply. Elias reached out with his damaged hand. His fingers trembled as he took the mitten. It was so small. It fit in the center of his palm like a heart. "I won't forget," Elias whispered. He tucked the mitten into his breast pocket, right over his own heart. Sarah cleared her throat. She reached into her bag. "I also brought you this. It was in the archives at the town hall. I thought you should have it." She handed him a framed photograph. It was black and white, grainy with age. It showed a younger Elias, tall and straight-backed, standing next to a teenage boy holding a trophy trout. The boy was beaming, looking at Elias with pure hero worship. It was Jacob. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He hadn't looked at Jacob's face in 15 years. In his nightmares, Jacob was always screaming or dead. But here he was alive. He was happy. "I remember that day," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "He caught that on a dry fly. First cast. He was so proud." "He loved you, Elias," Sarah said. She leaned forward, her eyes fierce. Arthur was a grieving father, and he was wrong. He wanted someone to blame because the truth, that nature is random and cruel, was too hard to accept. But Jacob never blamed you. I knew him. He looked up to you more than anyone." Elias ran his thumb over the glass, tracing the boy's smile. The guilt, that heavy, black stone he had carried in his gut, didn't disappear. It would never disappear completely, but it shifted. It became lighter. It became a memory instead of a sentence. "I tried," Elias said to the photo. "I tried so hard, kid." "We know," Sarah said. She stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We all know now." She looked down at Lily. "Come on, Bug. Mr. Elias needs his rest." "Can I come back?" Lily asked, looking at Elias. "Mom says you know where the foxes live." Elias looked at the girl. He saw the spark in her eyes, the same spark he had once had, the same spark Jacob had. The love of the wild. "I know where the foxes live," Elias said. A small, genuine smile cracked his weathered face. "And I know where the eagles nest. When the snow melts, when the mud dries up, you come back. I'll show you." Lily beamed. "Promise?" "Promise," Elias said. He watched them drive away, the dog barking out the window. He sat on the porch for a long time, holding the photo of Jacob in one hand and touching the red mitten in his pocket with the other. The past and the future. One he had to let go of, and the other he had to grab hold of. Spring arrived in earnest 2 weeks later. It came with the sound of dripping water, a symphony of melt that echoed through the valley. The creek swelled, rushing over the rocks with a joyful violence. The green shoots of crocus pushed through the black earth, defiant and new. Elias walked to the edge of the treeline. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat today, just a flannel shirt. The sun was warm on his back. He made his way to a small clearing overlooking the valley, a spot he had avoided for a decade because it offered a clear view of the avalanche path on the northern ridge. He stood there, leaning on his cane, and looked at the scar on the mountain. It was still there, a swathe of younger trees amidst the old growth, marking the path of destruction. But the trees were growing. The wound was healing over. Elias took a deep breath. He smelled the pine resin. He smelled the damp earth. "I'm still here, Jacob," he spoke to the wind. "And I'm not hiding anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the red mitten. He looked at it one last time, then pinned it to the branch of a young sapling growing at the edge of the clearing. A splash of red against the green and brown. A marker, not a memorial for the dead, but a landmark for the living. He turned around. Down the trail, he could see the dust of a car approaching. It was Tuesday. Sarah and Lily were coming. Elias Thorne straightened his back. He gripped his cane, not for support, but like a staff of office. He began to walk down the hill to meet them. His limp was still there, but his head was up. The ghost of Black Creek was gone. The hunter had returned. And for the first time in a very long time, the path ahead was clear.